The following story contains graphic images that could be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
Good evening. Tonight we devote our program to a part of the world you should hear more about, and that's Latin America. We begin in Colombia, a country that has received billions in U.S. aid to fight drugs. But now the Colombian government is in another struggle, one to convince the U.S. Congress that labor unions are allowed to freely organize in that country. Unions that have largely been the target of everything from intimidation to murder. 2,500 unionists have been killed in Colombia since the 1980s. The union violence has derailed a multi-billion-dollar trade deal with Colombia, a deal that could mean jobs for thousands of Americans. But American labor leaders have convinced enough members of Congress to say no deal, at least not yet.
If you want to understand why so many people see Colombia as a success story, you need to come here, to the bustling capital city of Bogota. Signs of international investment are everywhere, from insurance to banking to oil to more oil. And it's not just a one-way street. Colombia sells $14 billion of goods in the U.S. each year, making it one of the United States' biggest economic partners in Latin America. With energy security a priority in the U.S., supporters of the free trade agreement point out that oil and coal are two of Colombia's biggest exports. The United States imports more coal from Colombia than any other country, and the mines are a major employer in the developing economy. Plus, every year tons of cut flowers flow north to the United States, where 3 out of every 5 bouquets come from Colombia. A free trade agreement would expand trade by about another $1 billion a year. With hundreds of millions of dollars in trade in the balance, American business and industry have put big lobby money and their heaviest hitters behind this issue.
And we will do a better job of seeing that people know what the facts are. But it's still going to come down to Colombia is going to have to do more on the labor side.
Frank Vargo is Vice President for International Economic Affairs at the NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. He is one of the key lobbyists for the business interests of 14,000 American companies. He's a pro, and he's been a fixture on Capitol Hill pushing the Colombian free trade deal.
What's the single most important thing you think the American people should know about this trade controversy with Colombia at this moment?
I think that they need to know that this agreement is very much in our interest in terms of jobs. It's very much in our interest in terms of the national security of the United States. When we look around Latin America and say, well, who is our friend? You know, certainly Colombia and President Uribe are among the best. And others in Latin America look at the United States and this trade agreement saying, well, if this is how America treats its friends, you know, won't even pass a trade agreement with them, this is a very negative thing. And some leaders of other countries have pointed that out.
7 years into his term, President Alvaro Uribe maintains a 70% approval rating. Health care and education have expanded, and with or without unions, the gap between rich and poor has fallen significantly since he took office. But Uribe has a persistent problem. Just 500 miles north of Bogota, in the heart of coal country, lies the sleepy provincial capital of Riohacha. The anti-labor violence here last year helped create American unions' vehement opposition to the new free trade agreement. Violence overall is at 30-year lows in Colombia. But these men still live in fear. They are members of a coal miners' union, and it's people like them whose tragic stories have been so effective in stopping a Colombian trade deal in the United States.
Casi en el mismo término de tiempo teníamos circunstancias similares de amenazas. Entonces yo me preocupé, mi señora, la presión de la familia, salte de ahí, te van a matar. Yo pienso que es un terrorismo psicológico. Utilizan a los seres queridos para que influyan en nosotros que dejemos la actividad.
This man was targeted when he was elected to a small position in the National Coal Miners Union.
Estaba trabajando y llamaron a mi casa, de mi mamá. La amenazaron diciéndole que dijera dónde me encontraba yo o de no la iban a exprimir como una naranja.
These men are still alive, but this is what they fear.
Vi que él estaba tendido sobre la cama, boca arriba, tenía una bolsa negra cubierta sobre la cabeza y estaba la cama llena de sangre.
This young man lived next door to Rio Hacho coal miner and union member Adolfo Montes, who was murdered after leading an effort to affiliate his union, which had a good working relationship with the mine, with a left-wing political party.
Esta era nuestra habitación.
This is Adolfo's widow, Davis Castro, and this was their home. But she hasn't lived there in the months since the murder, and she says she's renovating to dull the pain. And her family life will never be the same.
Mi hijo Ángel me pregunta todos los días y me dice, mami, yo voy a estudiar mucho y voy a hacer una máquina de retroceder el tiempo porque necesito hablar con mi papá. Y yo, ¿cómo le digo que no va a poder hacer eso?
It's because of voices like these that American organized labor says the United States should not pass a free trade agreement with Colombia.
I think it would send a very bad signal to many other countries that we're willing to negotiate with anybody. And
Jeff Vogt is the head of international economics at the AFL-CIO, the United States' largest confederation of unions, representing over 10 million workers. The American unions have so far been able to effectively shut down this billion-dollar trade deal.
We have a real crisis, a humanitarian crisis in Colombia. And as you may know, we've negotiated labor language, labor protections in all of our trade agreements. But here we have a country that we know going into it from day one would be in a stark violation of those provisions.
But those who support free trade argue the violence is embedded in the culture and the left-right divide that remains from the Civil War 50 years ago. The fact that many leftists are unionists, they claim, is incidental. We saw this ongoing rift up close. Our reporter-producer, Adam Teicholz, arrived just in time for the costliest act of terrorism in recent memory. The famed left-wing guerrilla group, the FARC, were suspected of bombing this coal train to disrupt Colombian exports. Though the context for the union murders is complicated, the deaths and intimidation benefit Colombian industry. Rates of labor organization are low and falling, and on average, non-unionized workers in Colombia make 30% less than their union counterparts. And it's not just organized labor, but also their defenders who have suffered. In one infamous union murders case, active members of the Colombian military were convicted. The judge in that case is now jobless and fears for his life.
Las amenazas, sí, es normal. He recibido amenazas, sí.
This is former Judge Jose Nerio Sanchez. He ordered an investigation into Swiss food giant Nestlé's alleged involvement in the murder of a labor activist. And soon thereafter, he says, he was stalked by thugs across Bogotá.
Eso no es nada bien sentirse uno como al borde de la muerte.
Sanchez has made some courageous convictions and investigations. But Jeff Vogt of the AFL-CIO is quick to point out that convictions are the exception.
In 96% of the cases, roughly, the person who's responsible for those crimes, for those assassinations, are still walking free. And in many of the cases where there have been prosecutions, they're prosecuting the gunman, the guy who is ordered to do the killing, but the intellectual authors of these crimes, the people who have been planning these killings, are still walking free.
One case in which Judge Sanchez tried to hold the intellectual authors responsible involved on-duty Colombian Army soldiers murdering union leaders.
Fueron asesinados, sacados de sus casas, arrodillados y disparados por la espalda. Fue una ejecución extrajudicial.
Sometimes there's a clear connection between employer and the paramilitaries. Chiquita Brands admitted paying paramilitaries to protect their operations. Coca-Cola is accused of the same. Other companies, Nestle and the American coal miners Drummond, are suspected, not proven but suspected, of direct involvement in union murders simply to crush organizing and make more money. And the corruption extends into government as well.
What we're finding out now, because of some bold and brave steps by members of the Colombian Supreme Court, is that they found that over 60 members, current members of the Colombian Congress, senior members in the Uribe administration, up into and including his own cousin, have linkages with these paramilitaries. The paramilitaries were successful in infiltrating the state at the very highest levels. And we know of cases where the intelligence minister of Colombia actually turned over the list of trade unionists to paramilitaries who then went out and assassinated these people.
Is that a fact?
Yes. Yes.
Even President Uribe has come under fire for, it is said, not being clear enough in his condemnation of the paramilitaries. His government is pushing back against such charges.
No se trata de lo que se diga, se trata de lo que se haga.
Maria Isabel Nieto was the highest minister in Uribe's cabinet in charge of human rights protection, though she has since resigned. She oversaw a citizens protection program. Just listen to what they do to keep registered union members safe.
Chalecos antibala, escoltas, vehículos blindados, armas, medios de comunicación, tiquetes internacionales cuando se requiere que el sindicalista salga definitivamente del país por la gravedad de las amenazas.
Expenses like bulletproofing these SUVs cost the Colombian government $39.5 million in 2007. For the Colombian people, it's a small down payment for the hundreds of millions of dollars that could be generated by a new free trade deal.
Ningún sindicalista.
Nieto says that not a single union member under protection has been killed. And Frank Vargo of the U.S. National Association of Manufacturers says government and industry are united to protect labor organization.
You work with people who own businesses there, own manufacturing plants. What is their attitude toward the unions?
Their attitude toward the unions is a positive one. You know, people are not conspiring to try to prevent unions from being formed. Their attitude is they want greater security both for union members and for everybody else as well, including for themselves. So they certainly advocate the Colombian government doing everything it can to bring the situation more under control.
And you believe that's reality. I say that
do.
because
I
I
do.
know that you know that any number of American labor unions say, look, the basic problem is that business and big landowners are violently, literally violently anti-union, and that's what continues to spawn these killings and the reason they're opposed to this new trade agreement.
Well, union membership has been growing. The number of unions have been growing, and I think the Uribe government has been supportive of that.
Labor statistics, however, may suggest a different trend. Even as murder rates have fallen in the past several years, so too have levels of union membership, which are now among the lowest in Latin America. Back in Colombia's coal country, these port workers say the government has stifled their efforts to form a union in subtler ways than violence. It's refused to let them form a union because, technically, they're just temps. But every time they stay long enough to qualify for a union, they're fired and rehired. When they finally tried to form a union anyway, the government said no, and the company locked them out. Labor officials, these men say, follow the letter of the law that says temps can't unionize, but ignore the one that says companies can't union bust. So where does this leave the proposed new free trade agreement in the new Obama administration? Frank Vargo of the National Association of Manufacturers.
For the most part, it has been more a partisan issue, at least in the last administration. But now that you have a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, I am more optimistic that they will be able to work together to find a set of proposals and work with the Colombian government.
Well, as I listen to you, you are mildly optimistic?
I am.
To see whether this optimism is warranted, we spoke to Democratic Representative George Miller of California, who's been a leader of the opposition to the free trade agreement. He's met with Colombian union members and is still very worried about violence.
If that competition can always be kept down in terms of wages and benefits because of the imposition of the state of violence as a matter of policy, then you have to ask yourself, do you really want to have a free trade agreement with that country?
And yet, for the first time, he's open to trying to move ahead.
You do have a stated commitment by the president, by the government, to stop the violence. And in a number of instances, they've had a fair amount of success. And now the question is whether or not it can be strengthened, can it be continued, or has it been damaged beyond repair? It's a big question right now that remains.
But a newly empowered union lobby in Washington is coming out swinging harder than ever in the new administration, positioning labor in firm opposition to any movement on the free trade deal.
Once the Colombian trade unionists can come to us and say, yes, things are better here. We're free to exercise our rights, our laws are better, we're no longer being persecuted for what we're doing, then we can say, all right, now is an opportunity for us to have a discussion about the actual trade agreement itself. We still need to see dramatic progress in the country. We've seen now an uptick in assassinations. It's going in the wrong direction.
Last year, Colombia was responsible for half the union murders worldwide. A free trade deal would boost Colombian industry enough that even the most callous fat cat should want to bring the violence to an end. But somehow the rifts between left and right, labor and capital, combined with some fancy footwork by union lobbyists in Washington, have created an environment where Congress may very well put the stops on any deal. Now, coming up next, in a moment, we move to Bolivia, one of the world's biggest producers of coca. So stay here with us.
Missed an edition of Dan Rather Reports, or just want to see one again? We're now available on iTunes, so check us out.
And now, a look at how the United States tries to exert its power and principles in another country in Latin America, Bolivia. Bolivia is a desperately poor nation that's also one of the world's major cocaine suppliers. For years, U.S. anti-drug agents had free run of the country. Their target, the coca plant, the raw material for cocaine. And Bolivia's governments let the American agents in as part of a deal where Washington showered the country with foreign aid. This cozy relationship was shattered when a coca grower and union organizer, Evo Morales, was swept into office as Bolivia's president in 2005. He stopped U.S.-led efforts to eradicate coca and last fall expelled American anti-drug forces and the U.S. ambassador. But that was just the beginning.
We're at the edge of a thick rainforest in central Bolivia with a special anti-drug force of the National Police. This is a remote wilderness hours from any big city and 4,300 miles from Washington. But for years, this area called El Chupare has been under the close watch of the U.S. government. That's because we're in one of the world's major cocaine-producing regions. Hundreds of makeshift labs like this are scattered beneath the hardwood canopy, where locally grown coca leaves are processed into the expensive white powder for export abroad.
En su patrullaje rutinario encontró una fábrica de elaboración de cocaína del tipo móvil. Como se darán cuenta, acá tenemos los insumos como la coca molida listo para ser procesada.
The size of this pile of processed coca suggests the lab has been running unnoticed for weeks. A small engine, powered by drums of gasoline, churned out gallons of liquid cocaine. Once made into a powder, it would be worth tens of thousands of dollars. Bolivia is the world's third largest producer of cocaine, thanks to an endless supply of coca growing in its two lush valleys. Bolivian Indians revered coca as a sacred plant long before the U.S. declared its war on drugs. For centuries, they chewed the tea-like coca leaves to stave off hunger and get a boost, like a cup of coffee. But the United States sees danger in these coca fields. After all, America consumes more cocaine than any other country and has spent tens of millions of dollars on its war on drugs here. For years, officials from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, have provided intelligence, equipment, and training to these Bolivian police. Crucial help that led authorities to find and torch thousands of coca fields and labs like this each year. Now, all that has changed.
Hemos despertado defendiendo la hoja de coca y así hemos avanzado y estamos acá ahora para decir juntos todos en Bolivia y América liberarnos para siempre.
Evo Morales was a leader and organizer of coca growers and now president of Bolivia. He was elected in 2006 and promptly halted coca eradication. Late last year, he expelled DEA agents. Morales, Bolivia's first Indian president, has promoted the coca plant as an integral part of his country's ethnic and economic identity, and he made it clear on day one of his presidency that he would do so in open defiance of the United States.
¡Que viva Bolivia!
The Morales government has worked hard to distinguish between the coca leaf, which is a legal traditional crop, and to distinguish that from cocaine and the illegal narcotic, which is something that takes a great deal of processing.
American expatriate Catherine Lederber is director of the Andean Information Network, a research group that studies the impact of American anti-drug efforts in Bolivia. She says that while Morales may be a thorn in the side of the United States, it's the American government that actually helped put him on the world stage.
A lot of his rise to prominence is based on systematically trying to resist U.S. forced eradication efforts, U.S. pressure, U.S. violations of national sovereignty. That is something that's felt by all Bolivians. This is not something that specifically affected the coca growers, although it affected them most acutely.
Morales has adopted a policy that he calls coca yes, cocaine no. And there is no better place to see the new coca-friendly landscape than this anti-cocaine checkpoint. Not too long ago, police would be searching these vehicles for coca leaves in addition to cocaine and the chemicals used to process it. But now, just 50 yards away from a checkpoint that U.S. taxpayers helped to build, a surprising business approved by the Bolivian government. This vendor is selling coca leaves to truckers passing through.
The coca leaf is such an integral part of life in Bolivia that it's not considered at all a contradiction to have it on sale right here where the drug police are working. In fact, the drug police often chew it themselves to give them stamina, and truck drivers and bus drivers on long trips chew coca because, like coffee, it's a stimulant that keeps them awake for the long ride.
And as you can see in this warehouse, there's enough coca leaves for a lot of truckers.
Yeah. Relax, mamita, levántate.
Remer Agreden, a mayor in this coca-growing region, wanted to show that it's no more harmful than any other crop.
Mire, hermano, definitivamente, si nosotros vemos esta coca, mire, nosotros nos hemos enterado, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos, el simple haber tocado esta hoja de coca, dicen que ya estamos drogados. Definitivamente no es eso. En este momento nosotros podemos pichar, ¿no? Prácticamente no pasa nada, ¿no? Entonces, no hay ese comentario que se hace en el exterior, especialmente en Estados Unidos, no.
This shows the extent of the problem for the United States. Here, workers from a coca-growing collective are filling bag after bag of the leaves to be sold at a nearby market. The United States spent millions here trying to convince farmers to grow other crops, like pineapples. But Bolivians want their coca. Agreda told us that this U.S.-funded pineapple packing plant costs $250,000, but never had a chance of competing with the coca farms.
Pero no he ido más allá, como verá, aquí hace más de 8 años no se empaca una caja, una piña para exportar. No hay esa.
That's because, unlike pineapples, coca is easy to grow, and 100 pounds of leaves will sell for roughly $250, about twice what the average Bolivian factory worker will earn in a month. President Morales has made it a priority to develop a legitimate coca industry, producing everything from coca-based tea to toothpaste. He says his government closely monitors the line of production to make sure no coca leaves go to drug traffickers. The U.S., however, sees no room for legal coca growth, and this fundamental conflict is at the heart of escalating U.S. tensions with Morales. Morales says he won't forget the coca growers who helped sweep him into office, but he says he will not allow them to take part in any illicit drug trade.
It's important to judge not just what he's saying, but what he does.
Former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Thomas Pickering was one of America's highest-ranking diplomats during the Clinton administration. He played a major role in setting policy on the U.S. war on drugs, but says now that America's focus on eradication has failed.
Unfortunately, we have seen a highly flexible, highly agile opponent, so that when we sprayed large fields, it was inevitable that they moved deeper into the jungle, into smaller patches, often hidden by at least partially the jungle canopy.
Pickering wrote a report released by the Brookings Institution last fall that said steadily dropping cocaine prices in the U.S. meant imports of cocaine were as high as ever. But Washington is still trying to find ways to pressure Bolivia into reducing coca growth. President Bush in October put Bolivia on a blacklist and suspended a trade deal.
The India Trade Preference Act allows us to suspend trade preferences with countries that do not live up to their promises. And unfortunately, Bolivia has failed to cooperate with the United States on important efforts to fight drug trafficking.
But playing tough didn't slow cocaine production.
Fairly recently, the United States put Bolivia on this list of countries not cooperating with the war on drugs, and in hoping to punish or make him pay a price with President Morales in Bolivia, ending trade benefits. Is this an effective approach?
Bolivia has what we would call quaint ideas about coca production and consumption. Some of them have to do with their own culture and their own society, and that's probably their business. But others have now begun to impinge on others, including our economy, as they become an increasingly larger exporter. And if the government aids and abets this, which has been contrary to Bolivian policy in the past, then I think we have to recognize it.
I recently interviewed President Morales.
Yeah.
And among the things that he seemed to want to get across, saying, listen, because I'm pro-coca doesn't mean I'm not anti-cocaine. And this is not a direct quote, but I'm strongly anti-cocaine. Are we to believe that? What are we to make of it?
I don't know. I think that we ought to go back and say, if that's what you really mean, Mr. President, we would like to watch the situation in Bolivia and have it become clear to us that you're not, in a sense, aiding and abetting both the production of cocaine and its export to the United States and indeed elsewhere to our friends around the world.
But Bolivia expert Catherine Lederber doubts Morales would feel the need to justify himself to Washington these days.
With the Morales vision of coca, yes. Cocaine, no. Certainly in the upper echelons of Washington, there's not acceptance for this policy. But the influence of the U.S. in Bolivia, which used to be able to dictate policy, and especially drug policy, has diminished a great deal. And there are other governments that are willing to help Bolivia and fund Bolivia, Venezuela, other European governments.
That's right, Venezuela. President Hugo Chavez has promised to buy legal cocoa-based products produced in Bolivia and underwrite the growth of about 4,000 tons of Bolivian coca leaves. And Chavez is just one of a growing list of leaders hostile to the U.S. that are helping Morales bypass Washington. In a show of solidarity for Morales' socialist movement, Cuba's Castro brothers have sent Bolivia hundreds of volunteer doctors. Iran's President Ahmadinejad publicly applauded Morales for standing up for the U.S., and he pledged $1 billion in investments. President Morales came to New York in November 2008 to address the United Nations.
No estoy defendiendo la cocaína, jamás vamos a defender la cocaína. No compartimos con la transformación de coca a cocaína, pero sí parte de la cultura de los pueblos indígenas de la región andina, la hoja de coca como un consumo tradicional. Y lamento mucho que la Junta Interamericana de Fiscalización de Estupefacientes desconozca el consumo tradicional de la hoja de coca.
I had a chance to speak with President Morales when he was in New York. He had just expelled the DEA from Bolivia, knowing his anti-American allies would support him.
There is this conception that Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, and yourself are one and the same in terms of your desires. Is that true?
Decir que son iguales, no somos iguales, pero apostamos y trabajamos en una directa coincidencia, yo diría, por la humanidad.
What is the situation with Iran? There are these reports that you're getting help from Iran. Where do you stand with Iran? They're now getting involved in Bolivia.
Estamos empezando las relaciones diplomáticas recién todavía. Vamos a tener relaciones diplomáticas, pero también relaciones de comercio. Yo recibí la visita del presidente de Irán, él también me recibió en Irán. Y por ahora hay muchas conversaciones sobre inversión en tema petrolífero.
Morales said he would welcome foreign aid from any country willing to help as long as it doesn't expect too much in return. For too long, he says, the U.S. used its donations as a license to treat Bolivia like a colonial territory.
Mr. President, clearly relations have been deteriorating between the United States and Bolivia. Why?
Por los distintos embajadores de Estados Unidos acreditados a Bolivia hemos sido permanentemente entrometidos en aspectos políticos, hasta de conspiración a los gobiernos. Los movimientos sociales acusados o amenazados de terroristas, a los dirigentes sindicales a veces acusados de narcotraficantes. Eso viene vía la Embajada de Estados Unidos.
Officials from the U.S. Embassy in Bolivia declined our request for an interview, as did the U.S. State Department. American diplomats have largely remained silent on Bolivia since Morales expelled the DEA agents and followed up last fall by kicking out the U.S. ambassador.
Yo sé que el pueblo norteamericano o pueblo de Estados Unidos quiere cooperar y coopera con muchos países del mundo, pero en este momento esa cooperación va orientada a la conspiración de mi gobierno.
What proof do you have of the conspiracy, Mr. President?
Que los fondos de cooperación mediante USAID sean destinadas para financiar a los exministros de gobiernos neoliberales mediante fundaciones, mediante ONGs, donde todo planifican como opositores cómo debilitar y tumbar al llamado indio, que es el Evo Morales.
Some say Morales is simply following the populist script of his socialist mentor, Hugo Chavez. When things get bad at home, build up the United States as a looming enemy and use the threat as an excuse to consolidate power. Voters early this year approved a new constitution that will allow Morales to seek a second term in office. Chavez has made it a lot easier for Morales to stand up to the United States. He's giving the U.S. a run for its money by nearly matching the $100 million in American aid delivered in 2007, funding new hospitals, oil projects, and microloan enterprises. Venezuelan oil money will pay for dozens of new affordable homes being built in this Ayomara Indian community outside La Paz. Hundreds turned out for this groundbreaking ceremony. Chavez's goal is clear. By bolstering Morales' popularity, he hopes to keep a friend in office who's sympathetic to his anti-American socialist movement. Chavez has found a powerful ally in Morales. Despite Bolivia's small size and economy, the country's first Indian president has risen to become a hero to many across the continent. They see him as a fearless advocate of the voiceless poor. When Morales speaks, the world listens. So it's interesting to note that the Bolivian president says he admires and identifies with President Barack Obama. And he says he is confident U.S.-Bolivian relations will improve now that Obama has taken office.
Bueno, el cambio ya se ve. Un indio presidente en Bolivia y un negro presidente en Estados Unidos. Eso que nunca se ha visto en toda la historia de Bolivia y de Estados Unidos. Sectores más vilipendiados de la humanidad, ahora podemos también ser presidentes. El gran deseo que tengo, no solamente con el presidente electo de Estados Unidos, sino con todos los presidentes del mundo, es tener buenas relaciones, mejorar las relaciones, complementarnos para trabajar por nuestros pueblos.
The honeymoon didn't last. After determining that Morales had not done enough to curb coca growth, President Obama opted to continue the punitive suspension of the U.S.-Bolivian trade deal. And enraged Morales accused President Obama of lying for promising greater cooperation between the two nations, but, as Morales put it, continuing a heavy-handed foreign policy. Now, when we return, we take you to a U.S. Army base in Georgia to see how U.S. influence in Latin America is being tested. You'll want to see it.
The following story contains graphic images that could be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
Our next story is the result of a 6-month investigation. The subject is, once again, Latin America. Only we'll spend the next few minutes at a U.S. military training facility in the oak forests of Georgia. It's called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, or WHINSEC. For decades, soldiers and police from all over Latin America, including Bolivia and Colombia, have come to this academy for training at the invitation of the Pentagon. The question is, what kind of training, for what purpose, and to what effect? The academy was started to fight communism, but with the end of the Cold War, the mission officially shifted to anti-narcotics and stability operations. But regardless of the kind of operation, the academy has had a reputation, rightly or wrongly, a reputation for teaching soldiers from all over Latin America, some of them with histories of repression, to be even deadlier. Critics say the students were taught to use the harshest of interrogation techniques. Simply put, torture.
What do you teach, if anything, about torture and extreme interrogation techniques? Is that part of the curriculum here? Does that come up in the teaching?
Sir, absolutely not. I don't think that anyone that wears a U.S. military uniform will espouse torture in any way. I can assure you that that is not something that we pursue in this kind of environment.
Colonel Felix Santiago is commandant of WHINSEC, which sits on a small corner of the massive U.S. military base at Fort Benning, Georgia. And these are some of his students. Army cadets from Honduras, who are taking part in a 2-day tactical training exercise. While this program has faced criticism in the past, Colonel Santiago says it is now a model modern-day military academy, one that has taught 4 American values to thousands of soldiers from more than a dozen Latin American countries.
We are pursuing professional training. You have seen it yourself throughout the day today. And I think if you ask any student out there, that they realize that they can apply what we teach over here in terms of human rights into their own reality. That when you go into a particular real situation, whether in Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, you name the country, you know, that when you're challenged, and you're challenged by the conditions, that you do the right thing.
Training Latin American troops to do the right thing costs U.S. taxpayers some $13 million each year. But West Point graduate and U.S. Army Captain Brad Miller, an instructor here, says it is worth every penny.
But in this group of people whose faces we see here in the camouflage uniforms, there's some future generals.
Absolutely.
And high-ranking colonels who'll be in command.
Absolutely. And that is why it is so important, really something that I always tell my instructors, and I also have to tell myself repeatedly, is that we're looking into the future, and we have to realize that in the faces of these young individuals who right now are 19 and 20-year-old cadets, if we were to fast forward 25, 30 years, these are going to be the leaders of their nation.
This isn't idle speculation. Students are handpicked by their superiors at home, and scores of graduates have gone on to enjoy decorated military careers. The idea behind WENSAC is that graduates will use their training to assist the U.S. in taking on some of the hemisphere's greatest threats. Everything from terrorism to natural disasters to the war on drugs. We spent 2 days observing a number of classes, and we saw a wide range of skills being taught to prepare a professional 21st century soldier. The countries that come here reflect American interest in the hemisphere. These days, most students come from Colombia, the world's biggest producer of cocaine, a country that, unlike Bolivia, is cooperating in America's war on drugs. Cadets can even practice raiding a fake drug lab like the real one we saw in Bolivia, and they will get expert instruction from a sergeant on loan from Colombia's National Police Force.
Aquí se le enseña a los estudiantes cuál es el proceso que se realiza para producir clorhidrato de cocaína y las partes que conforman este tipo de laboratorio.
But that's not all. Students here learn everything from emergency field medicine to respond in the event of a hurricane or earthquake to tactical exercises in the field and a simulation of a planned raid, the kinds that would be used in an anti-drug operation. This is Juan Pino, a captain in the Panamanian Navy.
What's the most important thing you've learned here so far, Captain?
Aprendiendo muchas cosas nuevas que en mi país tendré que aplicar. Nosotros como Panamá enfrenta retos igual que Estados Unidos en cuanto a amenazas asimétricas a nivel mundial y practicamos en ejercicios multinacionales con los Estados Unidos.
This is the official mission of WENSAC. But this Army base in Georgia is not isolated from larger geopolitical currents. Some students come from militaries with tainted human rights records. And in the wake of Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and the war in Iraq, U.S. military objectives, rightly or wrongly, are viewed with suspicion by many people in Latin America.
You do not teach democracy behind the barrel of a gun.
Shut it down! Shut it down!
Father Roy Bourgeois leads a movement to close WENSAC. Shut it down. He describes the school as an outdated relic of the coldest days of the Cold War. This protest was outside Fort Benning last November. When the Catholic priests started all this 20 years ago, WENSAC was known as the School of the Americas, and its focus was training Latin American allies to beat back the threat of communism, perceived or otherwise, sometimes to beat it back quite brutally. Bourgeois says WINSEC trained some of Latin America's worst human rights abusers.
I'm not saying all of the soldiers here who are trained go back and commit these crimes against their people, but many have.
Bourgeois calls the academy the school of the assassins, and he cites as what he says is proof a large roster of former students that include some of the region's most notorious despots and dictators. Alumni like Panama's Manuel Noriega, now being held in Miami for drug trafficking. Argentine dictator Leopoldo Galtieri, whose death squads slaughtered thousands of leftists in the 1970s and 80s. And several Salvadoran soldiers implicated in a massacre of 6 Jesuit priests. That's just to name a few.
They simply say we cannot take responsibility for their crimes, but yet if you bring from El Salvador in those days, Guatemala, Chile, soldiers who have a human rights record that they have, known to be killers, and you bring them here and give them, combat training, and they go back and kill, there is this issue we call complicity.
The School of the Americas opened in Panama in 1946, at the beginning of the Cold War, and then it moved to Fort Benning in 1984 as part of the Panama Canal Treaty. About 5 years later, after the murder of the priest in El Salvador, Bourgeois settled into an apartment with a view of the base. From there, he founded the School of the Americas Watch.
We came here in 1990, just months after the Congressional Task Force reported that those responsible for the massacre of the 2 women and the 6 Jesuits were trained at the U.S. Army School of the Americas. We came here with a group of 10. This is when we started.
From this office, Bourgeois has tirelessly researched the academy, keeping close tabs on graduates. He's cross-referenced students' names with dozens of troops tied to human rights abuses. And he regularly updates the School of the Americas Watch website with these new discoveries.
What we have learned is that over 50,000 soldiers from Latin America came to this combat school to learn counterinsurgency, commando tactics. And what we learned was that many of those graduates went back to their home countries and caused a lot of suffering and death.
Bourgeois says brutality was part of the School of the Americas curriculum, and he cites as evidence several training manuals that had been used there in the 1980s, guides that advocated harsh counterinsurgency techniques forbidden under international law. They were made public by the Pentagon in 1996, but only after intense pressure from Bourgeois and other School of the Americas critics. This guide to recruiting and controlling informants advocates using, quote, arrests or executions, unquote. We asked Colonel Santiago, who took command of WINSEC last summer, to explain the so-called torture manuals. He told us that the books had been in a class library but were never assigned reading.
It is my understanding that the manuals that are claimed to have torture techniques certainly were not used in the instruction of students going through School of the Americas.
Public outcry following the release of the manuals led Congress to close the School of the Americas in December 2000. But a month later, in the same buildings, many of the same instructors taught the same classes to the same pool of Latin American troops. Only now it was called WINSEC. And the school had a new public relations department, whose job it was to tell American taxpayers that their money was not going to training tyrants.
What goes on in this building is very precisely, exactly U.S. doctrine taught morally, legally, and ethically. And the students who come out of here, for the most part, perform legally, morally, and ethically.
This is Lee Riles. He's the head of WINSEC's Public Relations Department. His mission is to highlight WINSEC's differences from the old School of the Americas. Riles says WINSEC is open to visitors, even the school's harshest critics. He says there's nothing to hide.
People are welcome to sit in classes. They're welcome to talk with any students or faculty they desire. They're welcome to review our instructional materials. This is perhaps the most open place in the Department of Defense.
But only up to a point. A few years ago, the Pentagon stopped releasing the names of WINSEC students, citing security concerns. That put an end to bourgeois research of graduates. But we wanted to try and see if we could get the names of recent students and investigate whether they were or were not tied to any human rights crimes. So we sent a formal records request to WINSEC. And this is what we got. Page after page of blacked out names. But WINSEC was only too happy to show us this. Here, Colombian police are practicing how to respond to protesters. Instructor Tony Raimondo is WINSEC's chief human rights expert, a position that was created when the School of the Americas became WINSEC.
And they face a situation, a real-life situation that's projected onto the screen.
Okay, so, here's a situation.
Right.
This simulation is designed to teach restraint. The guns are outfitted with lasers, and up on the screen, actors are portraying a potentially hairy scenario. We are guarding a checkpoint when demonstrators approach and suddenly begin to throw rocks. Then the situation escalates. Notice in the corner of the screen, one of the protesters pulls out a handgun and starts to shoot at us.
International law will not allow you to shoot because you're jeopardizing the people that are fleeing.
The rule is you can only open fire when you have a clean shot of the armed protesters. But some of the Colombian soldiers fired into the crowd, and that was the point of the lesson.
Well, I held off when he started to run, but I think we dropped him over here.
Right. Well, you did good. You did well.
What's the single most important thing you want American taxpayers to know, U.S. taxpayers to know, about what's being done here?
Our education is top quality, which means that our students are learning human rights in a manner that they can apply and conduct military and police operations in accordance with human rights.
Is this a success, or is it too early to call it a success?
I would say that it is a success, and I would cite the Amnesty International study, where one of the recommendations they made to the U.S. government is that the program that we have here at WINSEC be used as a model for the other military educational facilities in this country that are teaching foreign officers.
When we contacted Amnesty International, the human rights organization backpedaled. In an email, a spokesman wrote that Amnesty International, quote, has called on the U.S. government to provide more hours of human rights training to foreign security forces, as WINSEC now does. But we have not endorsed their specific training, unquote. But Colonel Santiago says he's seen firsthand the benefits of WINSEC's training. Prior to taking command here, he served in Iraq, leading troops from El Salvador that were part of the U.S.-led coalition, including some WINSEC graduates.
Well, is that or is that not what you see the value of the school? You develop relationships with the military in other countries, help train them, and then when some emergency comes about, you have a better chance of explaining the U.S. position and getting them to help.
Yes, sir, absolutely. I think that the school developed relationships throughout the hemisphere, and they are put to work when crisis hits. There's just no question about it. Those are long-lasting.
And he says what's long-lasting isn't just relationships between the United States and other countries in the hemisphere, but also a change in the values of militaries in Latin America, where human rights have seldom been a priority and there have been long histories of torture.
The point is, do you teach just that listen, torture is out of bounds, torture is not to be...
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
It's part of the teaching here.
Yes, sir. And we are required to teach the full spectrum of human rights. So torture is out of the question.
Sargento Viceprimero Tutistar Fajardo Libardo.
All the students that come through here have the opportunity to reflect on what it means to have strong convictions about right or wrong. The higher priority is what we all support, which is our freedoms.
Since this story first aired earlier this year, the House of Representatives approved an amendment to the 2010 military spending bill that would require the Pentagon to disclose the names of WINSEC students and the courses they took. School of America's Watch activists, however, told us they face an uphill battle to get that amendment signed into law. And that's our program for tonight. For HDNet, from New York, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net. To banking, to oil, to more oil. And it's not just a one-way street. Colombia sells $14 billion of goods in the U.S. each year, making it one of the United States' biggest economic partners in Latin America. With energy security a priority in the U.S., supporters of the free trade agreement point out that oil and coal are two of Colombia's biggest exports. The United States imports more coal from Colombia than any other country, and the mines are a major employer in the developing economy. Plus, every year tons of cut flowers flow north to the United States, where 3 out of every 5 bouquets come from Colombia. A free trade agreement would expand trade by about another $1 billion a year. With hundreds of millions of dollars in trade in the balance, American business and industry have put big lobby money and their heaviest hitters behind this issue.
And we will do a better job of seeing that people know what the facts are. But it's still going to come down to Colombia is going to have to do more on the labor side.
Frank Vargo is Vice President for International Economic Affairs at the NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. He is one of the key lobbyists for the business interests of 14,000 American companies. He's a pro, and he's been a fixture on Capitol Hill pushing the Colombian free trade deal.
What's the single most important thing you think the American people should know about this trade controversy with Colombia at this moment?
I think that they need to know that this agreement is very much in our interest in terms of jobs. It's very much in our interest in terms of the national security of the United States. When we look around Latin America and say, well, who is our friend? You know, certainly Colombia and President Uribe are among the best. And others in Latin America look at the United States and this trade agreement saying, well, if this is how America treats its friends, you know, won't even pass a trade agreement with them, this is a very negative thing. And some leaders of other countries have pointed that out.
7 years into his term, President Alvaro Uribe maintains a 70% approval rating. Health care and education have expanded, and with or without unions, the gap between rich and poor has fallen significantly since he took office. But Uribe has a persistent problem. Just 500 miles north of Bogota, in the heart of coal country, lies the sleepy provincial capital of Riohacha. The anti-labor violence here last year helped create American unions' vehement opposition to the new free trade agreement. Violence overall is at 30-year lows in Colombia. But these men still live in fear. They are members of a coal miners' union, and it's people like them whose tragic stories have been so effective in stopping a Colombian trade deal in the United States.
casi en el mismo término de tiempo teníamos circunstancias similares de amenazas. Entonces yo me preocupé, mi señora, la presión de la familia, salte de ahí, te van a matar. Yo pienso que es un terrorismo psicológico. Utilizan a los seres queridos para que influyan en nosotros que dejemos la actividad.
This man was targeted when he was elected to a small position in the National Coal Miners Union.
Estaba trabajando y llamaron a mi casa, donde mi mamá. La amenazaron diciéndole que dijera dónde me encontraba yo o de no la iban a exprimir como una naranja.
These men are still alive, but this is what they fear.
Vi que él estaba tendido sobre la cama, boca arriba, tenía una bolsa negra cubierta sobre la cabeza y estaba la cama llena de sangre.
This young man lived next door to Rio Hacho coal miner and union member Adolfo Montes, who was murdered after leading an effort to affiliate his union, which had a good working relationship with the mine, with a left-wing political party.
Esta era nuestra habitación.
This is Adolfo's widow, Davis Castro, and this was their home. But she hasn't lived there in the months since the murder, and she says she's renovating to dull the pain. And her family life will never be the same.
Mi hijo Ángel me pregunta todos los días y me dice, mami, yo voy a estudiar mucho y voy a hacer una máquina de retroceder el tiempo.
The following story contains graphic images that could be disturbing to some. Viewer discretion is advised.
Good evening. Tonight we devote our program to a part of the world you should hear more about, and that's Latin America. We begin in Colombia, a country that has received billions in U.S. aid to fight drugs. But now the Colombian government is in another struggle, one to convince the U.S. Congress that labor unions are allowed to freely organize in that country. Unions that have largely been the target of everything from intimidation to murder. 2,500 unionists have been killed in Colombia since the 1980s. The union violence has derailed a multi-billion-dollar trade deal with Colombia, a deal that could mean jobs for thousands of Americans. But American labor leaders have convinced enough members of Congress to say no deal, at least not yet.
If you want to understand why so many people see Colombia as a success story, you need to come here, to the bustling capital city of Bogota. Signs of international investment are everywhere, from insurance.
Porque necesito hablar con mi papá. Yo cómo le digo que no va a poder hacer eso.
It's because of voices like these that American organized labor says the United States should not pass a free trade agreement with Colombia.
I think it would send a very bad signal to many other countries that we're willing to negotiate with anybody. And
Jeff Vogt is the head of international economics at the AFL-CIO, the United States' largest confederation of unions, representing over 10 million workers. The American unions have so far been able to effectively shut down this billion-dollar trade deal.
We have a real crisis, a humanitarian crisis in Colombia. And as you may know, we've negotiated labor language, labor protections in all of our trade agreements. But here we have a country that we know going into it from day one would be in a stark violation of those provisions.
But those who support free trade argue the violence is embedded in the culture and the left-right divide that remains from the Civil War 50 years ago. The fact that many leftists are unionists, they claim, is incidental. We saw this ongoing rift up close. Our reporter-producer, Adam Teicholz, arrived just in time for the costliest act of terrorism in recent memory. The famed left-wing guerrilla group, the FARC, were suspected of bombing this coal train to disrupt Colombian exports. Though the context for the Union murders is complicated, the deaths